And so just to start, I want to take us back to the Earth Summit in 1992. And these are three of the many achievements that came out of that meeting. And the top two here are international treaties. And these continue to be highly relevant today. So later this year, here on this continent, COP27 will occur. This is the 27th meeting of the Conference of the Parties to this international treaty related to climate change. Later this year in Canada, hosted by China, but taking place in Canada, will be COP15 for this biodiversity treaty. And I would encourage you, so first I want to draw attention to the fact that over the same period of time, there have been about half as many of these meetings on the topic of biodiversity as on climate change. And I want to point out that actually each of these meetings is an opportunity to push forward policy, to synthesize science, to enable action. And so I think biodiversity science policy interface is lagging behind the climate change science policy face a bit. But I think we've learned a lot from our climate change colleagues. And so we're able to move quicker than we otherwise would have been able to. So two things to look for in this COP15 meeting later this year. First, there will be an agreement of goals and targets that lay out where we're headed between now and 2030. These will be internationally agreed upon targets. We've been debating them for the last 4 years. And this will set an agenda. It will also affect trade policy. It will affect regulations. It will lead to different laws that will show up in different countries. And so keep an eye on those targets and goals. There was discussion about, can we come up with one number for biodiversity that would be similar to 1.5 degrees warming for climate change, to try to get the whole community behind one goal. And the consensus in the biodiversity community was that there's no such one number for biodiversity, because we need to think about this at the ecosystem level. We need to think about it at the species level, at the genetic level. We also need to think about nature's contributions to people. There's also not just progress in parallel between climate change and biodiversity, but also these interactions in increasing recognition that there's feedbacks between the two. There was a workshop in summer 2021 that led to a report, which I would encourage you to take a look at. And this report talks about how further biodiversity loss will accelerate climate change. Further climate change will accelerate further biodiversity loss. So we want to reverse that cycle, and we can restore biodiversity to slow climate change. We can slow climate change to help conserve biodiversity. And just to mention this last one, this has come up in many talks, but the Sustainable Development Goals actually came as a product of the Rio +20 meeting in 2012, were established in 2015. And I know you're all very familiar with how biodiversity and climate change show up as a part of this broader framework. So now I want you to think about the scattered distribution of biodiversity on Earth. And so this map is trying to synthesize terrestrial ecoregions, so ecosystems on land and where there are groups of species worldwide, and combine that with information about freshwater ecoregions, thinking about watersheds, and then taking a look at a similar concept that's not called ecoregions, but a parallel idea for marine ecosystems. And so what I want to emphasize here is that no one sees this full picture. No one on Earth studies all of the species on Earth or all of these different ecosystems. Every biodiversity expert out there knows about a piece of this puzzle. And so it's only through collaboration and communication that we can begin to get our heads wrapped around what's going on globally. There's an estimated 8 million species of plants and animals, and we don't know how many of those are threatened with extinction. If we're honest, we don't know. And that's because only on the order of 10% of those species have been described, and only on the order of 1% of those 8 million species has been formally assessed for extinction threats. And so it's somewhere between 1 in 8 and 1 in 3 species that may be threatened with extinction globally right now. In working through some of these international policy reports, we brought together a team of scientists from around the world who focus on biodiversity and conducted a survey, because we felt like we couldn't ever get enough people in the room with enough expertise for enough types of species from different parts of the world. And so we were fortunate to get more than 3,000 responses to this survey from experts who have published on the topic of biodiversity over the past decade. And what we learned were that there's a few points on which there's global consensus, But more importantly, there are different perspectives and estimates for different groups of species in different regions of the world, and even different demographic groups of experts. And so we learned quite a bit through this. There's a video on my website, which is shown on the bottom here. I encourage you to take a look at that video. It's these co-authors speaking about their perspectives on both the drivers of biodiversity loss and also potential solutions that they see for the species they study. I think of biodiversity as a part of a socio-ecological system, and this is an integrated system. And we have cascading effects from these indirect drivers to direct drivers of biodiversity loss, leading to changes in many different dimensions of biodiversity. This then has cascading effects on ecosystem processes. And my own personal focus is on plants. And part of the reason why we focus on that is because this is an energy bottleneck for the entire planet. Through photosynthesis, the sun's energy and carbon, CO2 capture leads to formation of carbohydrates and storage and chemical bonds of that energy. And then that energy is what powers people through our metabolism, through our fossil fuels even. This is ancient photosynthetic products, and all other animals on the earth. And this is strongly regulated by plant diversity. So the productivity of a system is strongly regulated by the diversity of the plants in that system. And there are many different benefits that people obtain from nature, including those listed here, but this is a very small subset of a much longer list. Many of these that I've listed here depend on productivity of the system as well. And of course, there's many different elements of human well-being that flow from these relationships that we have with nature. One major challenge that we're facing right now is that we can't really assess the level of interaction with biodiversity that would be sustainable, because we have different spatio-temporal scales at which these relationships have been studied. And so we understand species extinctions at the global scale over periods of decades or centuries. That's come into focus. But our understanding of how changes in biodiversity impact ecosystems is at these much smaller scales of space and time. And ecosystem service studies tend to be at these intermediate scales. And of course, policy is at these larger scales. So a big focus of our work right now is on trying to scale up understanding of how ecosystem processes and services depend on the biodiversity of those systems. First, I want to just talk a bit about some of the work that's happened in the past and then where we're headed with this work. And so first, to motivate this topic, I would encourage you to think about changes in biodiversity in two different directions. There are many systems on Earth that are extremely low diversity, and there's potential to restore them or to strategically add diversity to not only croplands, but also rangelands and pastures, which cover more than twice the area of croplands globally. And so we can think about adding diversity and some of the potential benefits we could get from adding diversity. And we can also think about the loss of diversity from hyperdiverse ecosystems. Both of these changes are going on now, and the processes underlying the impacts on ecosystems and people are increasingly understood. But they weren't understood in the early 1990s. There was a meeting in Germany in the early 90s where ecologists literally drew lines on a chalkboard for some potential relationships between biodiversity and ecosystem functioning. And they argued about this, and they conducted a survey at that time as well and polled people on which of these relationships they thought might be the case. And most ecologists in the late 90s expected the top line here, a decelerating relationship, where there would be some redundancy of species and ecosystems, but that there would be accelerating impacts of biodiversity loss over time. To test these relationships, experiments were conducted, including this one at Cedar Creek Ecosystem Science Reserve. This study was established in 1994, and it's still ongoing. It's the world's longest running biodiversity experiment. And just for reference, this is located in the north central part of the US at the meeting point of these three really big biomes of North America. And so some results, many things have been measured in these plots that were experimentally planted with different numbers of grassland plant species. And you can see these are pretty big effects. So we're seeing plant productivity is 3 times higher in a mixture of 16 species than it is in a monoculture of 1 species. And so that's a big magnitude of an effect. And there's also effects on some of the other factors that have come up in these previous talks, including soil organic matter, soil fertility, and a variety, the stability of those measures from one year to the next. And this is by far not the only experiment of its kind anymore. There were already networks of these studies throughout Europe and in the 1990s. And there's now a network of tree diversity studies globally that continues to grow and expand. And the latest synthesis was 5 years ago now already. And in this meta-analysis, they found that there were 327 experiments that had manipulated the diversity of primary producers. Those are mostly plants, but in some cases, phytoplankton in aquatic ecosystems. And on average, the loss of 40% of plant species is expected to lead to loss of 8 to 17% of plant biomass. And so just to put these numbers in perspective, the latest estimate for the percentage of plant species that's currently threatened with extinction is 39%. So that's why I put this 40% number here. That was an estimate from the Kew Gardens a couple of years ago. And if we were to lose 8 to 17% of biomass, of plant biomass, that would be a transfer of carbon that's about 5 times the amount of carbon, all total human anthropogenic carbon emissions on an annual basis. So it would be 5 years worth of human carbon emissions. And there's also consequences for soil carbon being transferred to the atmosphere as we lose, which I'm not even accounting for, but are actually larger than these impacts on plant carbon being transferred to the atmosphere. And so from this meta-analysis, many people concluded that species were fairly redundant. And so because this is a decelerating relationship, people sort of assumed that the consequence of that is that we can lose a fair number of species before we start to see big impacts. But what that fails to consider is that it's different species in different years actually that are contributing to each of these ecosystem functions. And so during a drought, it's different plant species that are contributing than during a wet year, for example. And so what this figure is showing is it's only about a third of the species that are increasing ecosystem functioning if we look at 1 year, but as we go up to a decade, that number grows to more than 80%. And likewise, we can look at this across space, and it's different sets of species at different places that are extremely important. Different species are contributing to different ecosystem processes. And in the future, climate conditions or future levels of nitrogen deposition or future land uses, it's also a different set of species that would maintain ecosystem functioning. And so we need to think about redundancy with a broader lens here. We've also taken a look at how ecosystem stability, this is the reliability of productivity from 1 year to the next, depends on plant diversity. And each of these lines is a different experiment. And what we're seeing is that biomass production on a proportional basis is much more stable in highly diverse systems. And that's because of resistance to those climate events. And it's not really due to more rapid recovery after those climate events. And so what we find is that during a drought, productivity drops a lot less if you have a diverse community. But after a drought, actually any level of diversity is recovering fairly quickly, at least in the experiments that we've looked at so far. So what we've done so far is scale out to many different locations and also to observational studies. There's hundreds of observational studies that I'm not showing results from, but we haven't yet scaled up to larger spatial scales. And so this is really the major challenge that we're working on right now in this area. We have a number of efforts in my lab group that are trying to tackle this from different directions, thinking about food webs and trophic diversity, thinking about remote sensing and establishing some new experiments. You'll be happy to hear I'm not going to go through all of these, but I'll just mention some of the things that might be most relevant to this group. And so because we have lots of experiments with many measurements on the ground here, we're collecting data above them with some drones that are carrying hyperspectral sensors and LiDAR sensors and RGB sensors and thermal sensors. And then we're trying to understand how well can we estimate plant diversity using both satellite data and also these near ground remote sensing techniques, and how well can we estimate ecosystem processes? And can we detect the extent to which diversity is contributing to those ecosystem processes? And so I'll just show a couple results that are focused on the RGB data. And I'm really encouraged because actually with just taking pictures, we can build point clouds using structure from motion. And those point clouds are almost as good as the LiDAR point clouds. And using only red, green, blue bands of reflectance, we have almost as high quality of information as we can get from having hyperspectral data with many more bands of reflectance. And so this gives me hope that we can actually make a lot of progress with relatively inexpensive technologies. And so these are just some pictures of those point clouds over the experiments. And then I'll just show a couple quick results that we can detect differences in plant diversity. This is just with pictures taken above these plots. These are shallow relationships, which means that this is going to be a relatively insensitive metric for monitoring changes in diversity, but an effective one. And also we can use the point cloud density to estimate how much biomass is in the system. And this could be really useful in managed grazing systems and other related systems. And so to summarize, I just want to say, remind us that we need to collaborate together if we're possibly going to understand biodiversity. I think there's huge opportunities here to not only identify where we agree, but also to learn from one another and learn about what's going on in different areas. Many species are needed to maintain multiple ecosystem services multiple times in places in a changing world. And this is where I think AI could really contribute. We're not yet able to predict which species are going to have effects in various contexts. That's a very high dimensional problem. We could maybe make more progress on that. And again, I think cheap, inexpensive remote sensing technologies, maybe even with cell phones, we could push this forward quite a ways. So thank you.